There are some pretty fundamental problems facing the UK right now. Productivity growth has been stumbling for over 15 years, slowing from 2% to 0.2% per year. Homelessness in England increased by 8% in 2025, so 1 in 153 people are now homeless. And for those of us that can afford a home, rental affordability has tightened as stagnant wages are met with sharply rising rents. Many high streets up and down the country are also struggling, with 37 shops closing a day on average in 2024. And for many communities, the local bus stopped turning up years ago. But according to Britain's urbanist think tank Centre for Cities, these problems are not just related, they also potentially have a common cure, which they've outlined in this report, which points to a need for higher urban housing densities, stating that higher density urban development is essential for national prosperity. In other words, we need to build more flats. I caught up with the report's author to find out how this one weird trick could help fix Britain.
If you've got to build more houses, which we're pretty convinced you do, it makes sense to put them where you've already got houses, and then there'll be a knock-on positive impact for the economy, because there's some complicated academic papers which try and quantify productivity returns to density. There are arguments about how big the effect is, but the effect is always positive.
Centre for Cities' argument is that Britain's cities are simply not dense enough. They're significantly less dense than comparable ones in France and Japan. They state that at least 2.3 million homes are missing as a result of this lack of housing density. And this creates massive inefficiencies which we pay for in terms of sluggish economic growth, low productivity, and high housing costs. And can you imagine if we had 2.3 million additional homes in the UK? It's estimated that Britain's housing shortage is around 6.5 million homes, like we're physically missing 6.5 million homes that we currently need in the UK. Correcting this one thing would already make a significant dent in Britain's housing shortage. Let's say we were to address Britain's 6.5 million housing shortfall by building only housing estates like these ones, which most of you will recognise. We'd need to find nearly 850 square miles of land to develop. That's an area 40% larger than London. It's about the same size as the Yorkshire Dales and only slightly smaller than the Lake District. All would have to be concreted over for these low-density housing estates. And if we carry on with the status quo, that's where we're headed. And this is obviously a scenario that none of us want to see. By building more flats, we'd be utilising land that we've already developed and making our cities more efficient engines for productivity and growth. And we'd be doing it on land which is already developed, it's already urban. We're not talking about filling up even more green fields with suburban sprawl.
So if I were a national government that was trying to boost growth, which the current one is trying to do, and also trying to balance like environmental concerns, etc. People live more eco-friendly lifestyles if they're living in a flat in a city than they do if they're living in a detached house with a car. So there's lots of positive reasons.
But how does simply building more flats fix Britain? This video is going to explore how simply building more flats could have positive and far-reaching knock-on effects that could solve a number of massive problems that the UK is facing at the moment, like homelessness and the housing crisis, decaying high streets and town centres, our sluggish economy, the cost of living crisis, and even the UK's poor public transport. We'll start with the housing crisis and homelessness. This one is probably obvious, but let's get into the data. Britain used to build a lot more homes than we do now. House building rates right after World War II were about twice what they are today. Over 2 million people are reported homeless in 1944. That's nearly 10 times the number that are reported homeless today, many of them displaced from homes bombed during the Blitz. So in the 1950s, Harold Macmillan, who was housing minister at the time but who would become prime minister later on, announces this bold aim to build 300,000 homes a year.
Uproot the slums, repair the sound houses, put new life into the older houses, and keep building the new houses.
In reality, they actually ended up exceeding that goal for several years. House building hits a peak of over 400,000 in the 1960s. And it's this concerted effort between private enterprise, councils, and government funding through borrowing from the US that helps to achieve this goal, with about half delivered by private developers and half delivered by councils throughout this era. But from the 1980s onwards, the number of homes built by councils falls to virtually zero. And the gap this leaves isn't filled by private developers, and so over time, this widening housing shortage begins to appear. Today, estimates suggest that Britain is missing anywhere between 4.3 million and 6.5 million homes. But if we also account for homes lost due to the Blitz and post-war slum clearance, the problem starts even further back. This graph shows net house building in England and Wales. It shows that the decline in house building actually starts right after the end of the war. Net house building reaches a peak in the mid-1930s, and we haven't come close since. And to answer why that is, a good place to start is to look at the UK's planning system. About a year ago, I made a video about a proposed development in Shoreditch called Shoreditch Works. The scheme included new office and lab space to create jobs alongside new homes and the reuse of heritage buildings, regenerating a large site in the heart of the area. Architecturally, it was just a strong proposal, and the response from you guys in the comments was overwhelmingly positive as well.
An interesting thing about this development is there are no NIMBYs here. There was a design survey done by Create Streets. They found 78% of people preferred the new building to the old building. In terms of letters written to the council, 62 out of 65 were in favour of the development. You never really see that normally. And also even the local councillors who were on the planning committee, they were in favour of it by 5-2.
Despite all of this, it's had a pretty rough ride through the UK's planning system. Michael is a policy researcher at Britain Remade, a campaign to reform the planning process to deliver more transport infrastructure and housing to stem the UK's economic decline. He's been following the scheme closely, so I talked to him about how Shoreditch Works has become a case study of just how complicated getting things built in the UK has become.
The planning application runs to just over 9,000 pages. For context, that's about 3 times the length of all the Harry Potter books combined, 4 times the length of the King James Bible, 8 times the length of War and Peace. So what you actually see is that this planning application in particular, it's got to comply with national guidance. Then it also has to comply with London guidance. Then it has to comply with Hackney guidance, and then it has to comply with the South Shoreditch Conservation Area guidance. So there are 4 layers, has to answer to all of these different policies. Often as well, these policies are quite vaguely written. It's not just that they're overlapping, it's that they're in some senses contradictory. So one of the big problems with the Shoreditch Works project, according to the planning officers, was it was too big. Overbearing is a word they used a lot. But another problem was that it didn't have enough housing. Another problem was that it didn't have enough affordable workspace. Now, these policies they're mutually contradictory. The building needs to be bigger and smaller at the same time. And that was actually a key reason, like the 2 main things that were debated at the planning committee meeting, whether this building was too big and whether it had enough affordable workspace. And it's like, well, if it needs more affordable workspace, it needs to be bigger then. And on it goes. And it's these interacting policies that individually often are quite badly thought through, but when combined, they just produce this kind of Kafkaesque nightmare where nothing can get built.
But the UK's planning system has its roots in the early 20th century. And as we saw earlier, there was a massive house building boom both before and after the war. So if we could build housing at scale back then, why can't we now?
So we did some research on some blocks of flats being built in Waltham Forest in the 1930s. And there was 3 pages, plus a few drawings, to be fair, was the length of a planning application for a block of flats back then. So it's got insanely long. It's just one thing after another. There is a fire safety assessment. Everyone would agree that's a good idea. There's an environmental assessment, and there's a BAT assessment. At each point that these various assessments have been added, it was just one more thing. And those one more things over several decades have added up to thousands and thousands of pages of documentation. And that's what's happened here. So there's no one thinking about this holistically.
I guess the plan system then kind of sets itself up to the Second World War to be having a system where you have local plans which allocate sites for development, and then not much else happens everywhere else. The kind of anti-city narratives which drove a lot of kind of planning through the first half of the 20th century can be kind of framed in quite ruralist, English person, castle garden, etc.
One of the first things that strikes the visitor is the sense of spaciousness. There are no cramped back streets or narrow little windows overlooking blank brick walls, which are a common feature of far too many of our towns. You'll have already noticed how the rural look of Stevenage has been retained by leaving many of the original trees apparently growing out of the concrete.
But the real reason is a case where we've observed how bad and how sickly cities can make people, and it was a broadly kind of socialist agenda, which was we want to see middle industry, light industry move out of cities and have people live in towns, and we'll use the power of the state to coordinate suburbanization as part of that. but also the new towns programs and expanded town programs that happened just after the Second World War.
While suburbanisation and the movement of people out of cities had started before the war, it accelerated afterwards. Up and down the country, these sprawling suburbs began stretching out for miles around our largest cities, blurring the boundary between urban and rural. This is the era where our cities are left depopulated by people moving out of dirty, cramped and polluted neighbourhoods and into the green embrace of leafy streets and suburban semi-detached bliss.
And I think the kind of planning mindset hasn't really moved on from the assumption that people are going to be moving out rather than in.
In the 40 years after the Town and Country Planning Act was brought in, London's population was either stagnant or declining, and our big northern cities as well, like not many people lived in the city centre. And this idea that like people would want to live in zone 1 or 2 London in a high rise or in all those brand new high rises in central Manchester or Leeds. Like, that's quite recent, and in some ways I think planning law hasn't caught up with that. And so you see rules around light and dual aspect and so on, where actually people are just making the compromise, I want to live in a city centre.
Post-war planners assumed that everybody's just kind of fed up of cities and that in the future everybody will want to live in a house with a garden in the suburbs. So they weren't building blocks of flats mixed in with the houses, it was mostly homogeneous 2-storey semi-detached houses. And so you end up with a planning system which effectively prohibits these suburban areas from ever changing, densifying or adding more homes.
And that still exists in the planning system today. So if you go to any local plan, it'll have the spatial elements will be to do with the allocated sites. Some of them will be big, some of them will be small, but then most of the rest of the map is not really covered by any specific policy which guides how that area can evolve over time. And that then presents a lot of risk for anybody who goes and tries to submit an application to do something a bit different, or to knock down their house and build a new one, or build some flats in its place, etc. And when it's worked at its best, it's been building quite a lot of houses on allocated sites, and it's been a mixture of private and public management of that development, right? What it's never really done a very good job of is recycling existing urban land and having a system of rules which helps guide that. If you're not allowed to build above a particular density, then you've just got to build it outwards, and you've got to do urban extensions, and then the limiting factor on how much housing you have is how many urban extensions is planning system allowing, can your infrastructure support. And so if you're only allowing low density building, you kind of have to do urban extensions, and that provides a block.
As our cities and suburbs expanded, they gobbled up more of the green rural land around them. But the UK is only a small island. We don't have the mass of available land that the US had for its suburban experiment. So in the 1950s, greenbelt policies were introduced to prevent cities bleeding into one another and to protect our green and pleasant land. So this develops into a deadlock, where the planning system prohibits us from continuing to build homes in sprawling suburbs, but we're also not allowed to build more homes by upzoning and densifying the land that we've already developed. And this stalemate contributes to the crash in house building that we see from the post-war era onwards.
The British system has, by default, it doesn't really do zoning in the same way that other countries do it. It doesn't really give rules for any given particular location outside of an allocated site. But even on that allocated site, you won't get anywhere near as much clear information as to what is and is not going to be allowable. It doesn't go as far as saying this kind of thing here is definitely going to be permitted. And in the UK system, where you have that upfront consultation, there's always the expectation that you'll be able to object later on. And so I think it has like a particularly difficult effect in cities, because it really reduces the amount of potentially developable land.
And I don't want to blame the planning system for everything. There are a multitude of different reasons why we're not building enough homes in the UK. For instance, we have high land and construction costs in this country. We rightly pay our construction workers a lot more than we used to. And we're just coming out of a period of high inflation, which is a big reason why we're currently building even fewer homes than we were before. Another reason is complications brought about by the building safety regulator, which has made it even more difficult to build tall residential buildings. But that's going to be a topic for another video. Data from Urbinfo, who have tracked every housing scheme in Manchester for over a decade, show that 40,820 homes have completed since 2015, and right now there are 11,591 homes under construction. Yet more than 33,000 homes with planning approval haven't started construction. That's nearly 85% of the past decade's total output. And some of these consents date all the way back to 2015. When tens of thousands of permitted homes remain unbuilt, some of this constraint clearly lies beyond the planning system.
But because we're not building enough homes where people actually want to live, family houses are being split into flats and HMOs, or bedsits that are rented out room by room. There are now nearly 500,000 HMOs across the UK, the highest number on record, and that keeps rising. What was once a mainly London phenomenon is now spreading nationwide. Even rural areas like East Devon have seen a 523% year-on-year increase, with many councils reporting numbers doubling between 2024 and 2025. It's increasingly common to see homes rented without living rooms as they're converted into extra bedrooms to meet demand. In short, as the system fails to deliver enough homes, people are being squeezed into smaller and smaller spaces.
It's something you hear a lot, like, oh, we want family homes, not 1 or 2 bedroom flats. It's like living in a 3-bedroom semi-detached house in the suburbs is great, but people who'd rather live in a 1-bedroom flat in the city centre, that's also great. It also means they're not living in a HMO that stops people living in those 3-bed semis. 1 and 2 bedroom flats is how you free up the family homes that are currently occupied by, friends of mine living in a 5-person HMO who really would rather not. They'd much rather live in a flat. And that's okay, and it should be encouraged, right? Because if they're not living there, they're living in a HMO, basically. It's bad for everyone. That just trickles down the system. These people go elsewhere, push up rents for other people. It's the worst of all worlds for everyone. Whereas, let people live where they want to live.
Advocates of the current planning system will say, oh, but they could apply to do flats, and then the council could decide to discretionarily ignore its own rules. But that's an enormous bet that the developer is taking in that situation, and so they don't do it. If you're a small business and you've eyed up some land and you've gone through 1 round of planning permission and you've said no, that is an enormous cost if that's like your only project. And then you've got another 2 years before you see any income coming in, or 3 or 4 years. And so managing a small number of sites in the existing system is really difficult. And that's why you don't see so many smaller developers.
Most homes now, the vast majority of homes, are delivered by what are called the volume builders, people like Taylor Wimpey, Barratt Homes, etc. Now, the reason that's true is because the small and medium-sized businesses have all gone bust. If you're a builder who builds 5, 10 homes a year and you get 2-3 years of delay, your business is gone. It's just finished. And so many of them are. Like back in the 70s and 80s, very large portions, like 40-50% of our homes were built by SME builders. Now it's more like 10-15% because they've all gone bust.
A result of all of this restriction on new development is a crippling housing crisis characterised by a massive surge in homelessness, a critical shortage of social rent homes, increased poverty, record high rents with renters spending over 1/3 of their income on housing, and a generation locked out of any hope of home ownership. 172,000 children are now homeless in England, and councils spend £2.8 billion a year combined to put homeless families into temporary accommodation, up 25% last year. It's a crisis which is driving many of the other crises that Britain is currently facing. And it's frustrating because we have this dichotomy of a stagnating UK economy where we need to create more jobs, attract more investment, revitalise our cities, towns and high streets and generate more wealth. And at the same time we have this huge demand for something, housing, that ordinarily a free market economy would jump at the chance to correct, potentially bringing tens of billions of pounds into the economy every year.
And this isn't just about making more money for developers. Imagine a block of 100 flats gets built in the centre of a UK town. Before people move in, it's already created jobs and income for local architects, construction workers, electrical fitters and plumbers. Let's say 200 people move in, roughly 2 per flat. They all need furniture, and of course many will go to the local IKEA, but that maintains jobs and incomes for workers there. Some will buy things from furniture shops on the local high street as well. It's 200 more people using the local gym, swimming at the local pool, drinking at the local pub, eating at local cafes and restaurants, and browsing local clothes shops. When they need groceries, they'll use supermarkets, butchers and greengrocers, all of which support local businesses and brings money into the town's economy. For instance, it could help stop shops and pubs from closing. The residents will pay tax to the local council, helping to fund the ongoing maintenance of the town. And because they live in a flat in the town centre, they're probably less likely to shop online for stuff, because why buy something online and have to wait a few days for it to be delivered when they can get it quicker by walking down to the high street and supporting local businesses there instead. As residents move in and out over time, they'll each furnish and refresh their homes, generating ongoing spending in the local economy. As a result, the economic benefits of this one new apartment building are felt repeatedly across different sectors in successive waves, providing a lasting boost to the local economy.
I think that there are some reasons that density does make places exciting places to be. If you're talking about like the liveliness of the high street, the more people you have in and around, the more likely it is that a shop is going to have people come and patronise it. If you've got a low density town where everybody's not coming into city centre anymore, a good thing that you could do is add some housing. And I think that applies to big cities as well. The more kind of bustle that you've got going on, the more likely it is that it feels like it's got a thriving community. It's easier when people are in close proximity to each other for them to get together and do stuff, make music, put on a amateur dramatic thing, as long as you have the provision of public goods like, community centres and stuff like that.
And by now you might be saying, but I don't want to live in a flat. Maybe that lifestyle doesn't work for you and you enjoy living in a suburban house with peace and quiet and a garden. And that's fine. Houses will still exist, and the best places are those that have a mix of housing typologies which attract all kinds of people. Personally, I love living in a flat and it works for me at this stage in my life. My bills are cheaper because I have less space to heat, and I have more time because I have fewer rooms to clean, and I feel safer in a flat because my front door is removed from the street. I don't have a garden, but I do have a balcony, so I still get some private outdoor space, and there are several parks within a 5-minute walk which the council maintains for me, so I don't even have to do any gardening, which, considering I have a full-time job and this YouTube channel, works pretty well for me. Maybe one day I'll move into a house, but right now I'm happy in a flat. But the system we have and the types of homes we build in this country stop people from being able to make that choice, and that's something that I think the government should address. Not because it benefits me personally, but because the facts and the data show that it would benefit the whole UK in a multitude of different ways. There is demand for high density living in the UK. We find that places where people live close together tend to have higher property values, which is a pretty good indication of a place's popularity. It makes sense to build more homes in these sorts of places to let people live where they want to live. It's now a well-established fact that larger, denser cities are generally more productive. Cities drive over 80% of global GDP while occupying just 3% of the world's land. And in the UK, the largest 9 cities account for 50% of the total economy. By concentrating businesses, jobs and talent, cities bring people closer to higher wages and opportunities. When people share the same land, infrastructure and ideas, it drives specialisation and innovation and ultimately raises productivity.
The most productive jobs tend to locate in city centres, where you can have lots of workers getting relatively easy access to that job. And then you also have sort of like agglomeration effects where, because this business is near that business, they can talk to each other much more easily than if they were on opposite sides of the country. If you have a denser city, you have a larger labour market within an easier distance of that job. And that's why you get all of one type of industry tending to locate in the same place. Like LA has Hollywood because it's kind of built on itself and everybody wants to be there. And that is the centre of that bit of the cultural world, in the same way with the city in London. And so if we want our economies to perform like the economy of bigger cities, big medium-sized cities in other countries, we probably need to do something about the built form as well.
And Maurice's point about changing the built form of our cities is crucial, because Centre for Cities research points to a clear link between density and productivity.
Across the G7, workers in the largest cities have the highest productivity. New Yorkers each contribute almost $180,000 each annually towards the US economy, and Londoners generate about $130,000. And in the most productive economies, workers in the next largest cities generate less than the primary city, but still more than the rest of the country. That is with the exception of the UK, where our secondary cities are actually less productive than the country at large. And 7 of the 20 least productive big cities in the G7 are British. Even London underperforms compared to places like New York, Munich and Paris. The report links this to the low-density built environments of our cities, which shrink the size of the skilled labour pool and make them in reality smaller cities than they appear to be on paper. And so to boost productivity, our cities need to densify, bringing more people closer to jobs and opportunities to strengthen agglomeration effects.
Anecdotally, in recent years, Manchester has shown how a pro-high-density development mindset can transform productivity and economic fortunes, with Manchester now beginning to close the productivity gap between it and London. I did a whole video on this, so if you're interested, please feel free to go and check that out.
And there are other economic benefits to be had through building the homes that Britain needs. Research from Shelter and the National Housing Federation has found that delivering 90,000 social rent homes would deliver 32.6 billion in economic benefits in just 1 year, and support 140,000 jobs. And after 30 years, that investment would result in a £12 billion profit for the taxpayer. And 90,000 homes represents just 1/10 of the UK's total social housing need. Meanwhile, Homes England estimate that building the 6 million or so homes that represent the UK's housing shortage would generate over £133 billion in tax revenue, including over £10 billion in annual revenue for local councils.
And at this point you might be asking, doesn't Britain already have enough flats? The centres of cities like London, Birmingham and Manchester are full of them, and there's a lot of small towns in the UK that have flats too. Compared to our peers though, flats make up a staggeringly low percentage of UK housing stock, about 13%. Across Europe, that figure is 45%, so you're over 3 times less likely to live in a flat in the UK than the European average. And that's a problem because as well as being a small island, we also have a large population, the second largest in Western Europe.
All of those people need to live somewhere, and flats are the most efficient way to do it, enabling you to stack homes on top of one another and take up less land than the same number of houses. But our obsession with building houses instead of flats has meant that we've lost beautiful countryside like this to sprawling housing estates. It also means that houses are squashed into smaller plots of land, so that suburban dream from 100 years ago of huge rural cottages looking out over acres of sunlit meadow has morphed into houses that are clustered together with small gardens and barely any trees. The houses we build are the smallest in Europe. An average 3-bed house in England is about 1034 square foot, while an average 3-bed flat is 982 square foot. So on average, you're only getting an extra 50 square foot with a house compared to a flat. That's about half the size as an average UK parking space. All seems a bit redundant.
So if we built more flats and used land more efficiently, instead of shoehorning everyone into tiny houses, we might actually be able to build bigger houses as a result, which means everyone benefits. And that inefficiency doesn't just relate to land use. It might be making our bills more expensive too.
According to a recent survey, this is the most prominent issue on people's minds in the UK currently. Now, building more flats alone won't solve this crisis, but it can play a significant role in addressing it. The biggest monthly outgoings for an average UK resident are utilities, council tax and housing. We'll start with electricity and gas, which make up 12% of monthly expenditure. The homes we live in are some of the oldest in Europe. Nearly 40% were built before 1946, while only 7% were built this century, compared to 10% in France, 18.5% in Spain, and 22% in Ireland. This has implications for our energy bills, as older homes tend to be less well insulated and are therefore more expensive to heat. And according to ONS data, flats are the most energy efficient housing type in the UK, with a median efficiency score of 74 compared to all types of houses which hover around 68 to 69. Flats are often more energy efficient due to being surrounded by other heated units and having less surface area facing the outside. This translates into much lower energy costs for people living in flats versus houses, with those living in flats paying 38% less for gas and electricity than people living in 3-bedroom houses. So by favouring houses and our continued failure to build new efficient homes, we could be unintentionally deepening the energy crisis. The next largest monthly expenditure for a UK household is council tax.
The burden that low-density housing places on public spending cannot be overstated. They require more roads for every resident, more water pipes, more sewers, more power cables and utility wiring to maintain, more pavements, signposts and landscaping. They cost more for councils to provide, and because suburbs are spread so thinly, they're more difficult for emergency services to cover and protect. The reason you might see fewer police officers on the street than your grandparents did is because there's more streets for them to cover nowadays.
I've collected data data on all the annual Band D council tax charges for every local authority in England. People in rural Rutland pay the most, £2,671 per year, while people in the dense inner London borough of Wandsworth pay the least, just £998. And while this only shows the two extremes, there's a clear trend. When we compare council tax with population density, council areas with more people per square kilometre tend to charge less in council tax. And there are some outliers, like Nottingham is a city and therefore has a high population density, but it also has the second highest council tax in the country. And you also get high charges in other cities like Liverpool, Bristol and Oxford. But most councils charge over £2,000 per annum for Band D council tax. There are only 13 that charge below that. And of those 13, 11 of them are London boroughs. 10 of those are inner London boroughs, covering the densest parts of the UK. Now obviously London has higher earning households who foot more of the bill, meaning that most people don't need to pay as much. And London councils also get more income from being in one of the wealthiest cities in the world and everything that comes with that. And there are lots of factors influencing council taxes. It would be wrong of me to directly correlate density with low taxation. But let's say we compare two streets. They're the same length and therefore have the same amount of pavement and utilities to maintain. One street is sided with single-family dwellings, 10 in total, while the other is lined with 5-storey double-sided blocks of flats with 100 dwellings in total. The street with the flats has 10 times the number of households paying council tax as the street with houses. That is immediately going to make a huge difference to council tax revenues. And when we compare council tax with the percentage of flats in each council, the correlation strengthens even further. Flats make up 50% of total housing stock in the 30 areas with the cheapest council tax. In the 30 areas with the most expensive council tax, flats make up just 18% of total housing stock. Bear in mind that the 30 cheapest areas are paying 35% less in council tax than the 30 most expensive areas. With more households paying in, that creates a lower tax burden for each individual household. But by far the largest monthly outgoing for UK households is on housing, with more than half of our total bills going on either mortgage or rent. House prices and especially rents have risen considerably in recent years and in many cases have outpaced wage growth. And while it would be easy for me to say, well, we need to build more homes, that will obviously tip the supply and demand balance and bring housing costs down, is actually not as clear-cut as that. It might seem like an obvious solution, but how do you explain the fact that London, despite having the most homes of any region in the country, is also the most expensive? It also doesn't explain how somewhere like Tokyo, one of the densest cities in the world with a majority of people living in flats at extremely high densities, is also one of the most expensive places to live in the world. It's a brick wall I continually hit when advocating for more housing because while it might seem like an obvious solution, the link isn't as intrinsic as it first seems.
There's lots of different things which govern how expensive a house is to buy or how it is to rent, and it has a lot to do with the geography of the economy in general. But how would you explain London's rents being more expensive than Newcastle's rents? The main explanation for that is the strength of London's economy, how much people in London get paid on average, and therefore how much people are willing to bid up against each other to pay for a given house. So if you take that as your main factor, that's why mega cities tend to be more expensive, because the people who live there tend to be paid more. And that's like your baseline truth. Then you've got to look within that city and go, why is one place more expensive than another place? And that will be to do with kind of the desirability of that area in terms of like proximity to the jobs or proximity to other amenities, stuff like that. So let's say you've got some bit of Hackney, which 30 years ago was relatively depopulated and it wasn't as desirable to live in because there wasn't the overground, and London's economy was only just starting to do the booming that it has been doing now for the last 30 years. So let's say if you fast forward 20 years, Hackney rents have got more expensive, and then you add some more housing in Hackney on top of Hackney having generally improved. Is adding that new housing going to make Hackney and that specific bit of Hackney cheaper? I think it's a bit of a question mark. It might make it cheaper than it would have been otherwise, but it's probably not going to be like downward pressure on those very, very localized rents, because Hackney now has all of the amenities, all of the connectivity that it has now got. Building more housing in Hackney probably does do is keep rents in Enfield a bit cheaper than they would otherwise have been.
Basically, because Hackney has grown more desirable, that's meant that people have had to search neighbouring areas for cheaper rents. This causes an influx of people wanting to live in somewhere like Enfield, which is up the overground line from Hackney. And we can see from this graph that as rental values have risen in Hackney, Enfield values have also risen in tandem, pushed up by this outward movement of people forced out of Hackney.
So I guess you can kind of see rents as a kind of like continuous whack-a-mole relationship. I would see house building and its impact on rents as being like one of the multiple tools that we could be thinking about. So the housing market doesn't exist across the country, but it also doesn't exist on a very micro level in Hackney, right? But let's say you want also people to have access to lower paid jobs. Let's say you're only going to pay your teachers and nurses so much through the public sector, but we still want our nurses and teachers, don't want to exclude them from having access to all of those same amenities that being in a city can offer you. But I guess what I would say is the rationale for the public sector intervening to provide people with access to places and access to jobs so you don't get a kind of peripheralization of people on poorer incomes is you really need to provide public housing in cities as well as private housing.
So building more flats in one location might not make rents there cheaper, but it could reduce the more negative effects of gentrification where people are pushed out of one area only to cause a wave of increased rents in another.
And there's still a strong case for boosting housing supply by building more flats to help control costs, keeping this major monthly expense in check. In Auckland, planning rules were changed to allow more high-density development. It immediately led to a boom in house building, which meant that rents were kept in check compared to Wellington, which delivered much fewer homes over the same period. A clear sign that building more flats benefits everyone's housing costs. And research from the US, Sweden and Finland shows that even when new build homes are expensive, they still benefit the wider market. As higher income households move in, they free up homes elsewhere, setting off a chain reaction that increases availability across all income levels. And crucially, this effect grows even stronger in places that deliver more housing.
But ultimately, strong, successful economies are always going to be expensive places to live. Adding more homes can intensify that by boosting agglomeration, which reinforces the very dynamics that we've discussed in this video. London is costly precisely because it's successful. Its high concentration of flats supports density, which drives the economic and social benefits that we've outlined in this video, attracting companies that want access to a larger population and workforce, resulting in a virtuous cycle for the economy.
It's no coincidence that dense cities tend to have strong public transport. The two reinforce each other. More people living and working near a station means more potential riders.
If your city is low density, it's also only so good that public transport can ever get. You need a high level of ridership to make bus services and trams and stuff like that sustainable. And the lower the density, the less sustainable that is. That's why you need to have massive subsidies for rural bus services.
Beyond London, UK public transport often falls short. Leeds and Bristol remain major European cities without tram or underground networks, while Birmingham and Manchester's transit networks lack the depth and reach seen in comparable continental cities.
And there are multiple reasons for this. One key issue is the government's tendency to view infrastructure as expenditure, not investment, which has left a lot of UK cities with embarrassingly stunted transit networks. As a result, UK cities have some of the lowest public transport ridership in Europe. And it's also true that the low density nature of most UK cities makes them unable to support mass transit. But there's a problem with saying build more flats and we'll get better public transport.
It's a bit of a chicken and egg problem. So if you want more sustainable public transport, you need to kind of increase your densities, and it's a real problem for UK in that to increase densities, maybe you need better public transport to help people get around and sort of forget about using their cars, but then also to support that public transport, you need good densities.
The best place to start is probably by making the most out of existing transit hubs. In Lille, planners designated 500-metre zones around major metro and tram hubs for high-density development, boosting density and driving a 30% rise in ridership. The result was stronger funding for existing infrastructure and more people shifting from cars to transit. Or in Hong Kong, where the Transit Authority was empowered to develop land around its stations. By selling and leasing those homes, it increased ridership and lifted income by 60%, with the transit provider effectively operating as a property developer. The proceeds are reinvested back into the network, funding further upgrades and extensions. In the UK, the London plan has been doing similar for years. That's why we've seen clusters of tall buildings appear around places like Elephant and Castle, Vauxhall, Croydon and Canning Town. By developing at a high density around existing transit hubs, we can boost passenger numbers on the existing network, reduce the amount of subsidy they require, and give transport authorities more money to cross-subsidise less profitable routes. But if you're wondering why your area lacks a metro or even a decent bus service, ask how much demand exists in your area to sustain one. Low-density suburbs with homes spread far apart struggle to support frequent services. There simply aren't enough people and passengers to make them viable, so routes and services get cut.
So before I lived in London, I lived in Preston in Lancashire, and I drove everywhere because it's not very dense and because you kind of have to drive everywhere. In London, I don't own a car. I cycle or take public transport everywhere I go. And most people in inner London, that's how they get around. They have some of the lowest carbon emissions per capita of anywhere in the country.
The solution is to support more high-density development which places people and therefore passengers closer to stations. In other words, build more flats. So now that we've explored all of the ways that building more flats can address some of the key issues that Britain is facing, we'll look at what the government is doing to recognise this and whether their proposed solutions go far enough. And Maurice's research looks to the planning systems in France and Japan for lessons on how the UK system could be reformed.
They have quite different planning systems than us. Let's say there's a patch of land, let's say it's a car park, or let's say it's got 2 houses on it. If you were in France or Japan, you could go to the local zoning plan and find out quite easily the basic parameters of what you're allowed to do with that piece of land. It might say you're not allowed to do anything, this is a car park and we want it to be a car park forever, but it might also say this is part of a broader zone which you can build houses on within these parameters. They're only allowed to be this high, they have to be these materials, you have to consider how light interacts with other nearby buildings, so you can't build in this corner but you can build everywhere else, type stuff like that. You have to pay this much of development charge towards the provision of general infrastructure in the area. But they provide that information in a map, and they provide it for everywhere in the city.
By clearly setting out what can and can't be built in specific locations, cities in France and Japan have made development more predictable. Councils agree plans with existing residents up front, giving developers clarity and removing much of the uncertainty from delivering high-density development in established residential areas.
We've called it the kind of front-loading of discretion. So there's still a lot of public sector ability to guide what happens in terms of planning, but a lot of the decisions that could be made by the public sector when they're going, this is allowed, this is not allowed, are made before anybody would even submit an application. And what you don't see in France and Japan is okay, so the zone says you can build up to 6 stories. You do not immediately, as soon as that zone is implemented, get all of those buildings being knocked down and built to 6 stories. It happens over a period of sort of years and years, decades. What you'll see is that within that kind of de-risked environment is that a lot more stuff is allowed and a lot more stuff is easy to find out whether it would be allowed than it would be if you were doing a development in a British city.
In the UK, we have local plans, which allocate sites and set development parameters shaped through consultation with councils and residents. But even schemes that are compliant with the local plan must pass a discretionary planning process and can still be rejected even if they follow the rules, often by politicised planning committees.
So we consult on our local plans. A lot of local plans are really out of date, so a lot of them are coming forward at the moment, a lot of them being consulted on. And that is an opportunity for people to get involved in their area and say, I support this thing. But because there's still that after the fact, you can still submit loads of objections when something that even is fully compliant with the plan has come in. You can still argue that there's some reason now that shouldn't be allowed. And so I think that will probably mean that fewer people get involved at the plan stage because they don't see it as an existential threat because they can always argue later. And also because those local plans are less powerful, they're also less interesting to engage with.
And I'm not advocating for some developer free-for-all which takes power away from local residents to be able to say no to new developments and allowing massive 20-storey towers to be built next to semi-detached houses. The systems in France and Japan retain the ability for local residents to oppose and change plans. It just moves that ability to a much earlier stage in the process.
And they see that as a kind of deregulation, that as we're going to remove the constraint. And I think I wouldn't quite see it like that. It's more like we're moving the way that regulation happens. It's not some regulation and no regulation. It's one version of regulation and one system which seems to be performing quite badly, and another type of regulation which seems to be performing better.
And whenever we suggest something so fundamental to UK society as planning reform, we first have to trial it in one part of the country to see how it works, and then use that to work out whether it's a good idea to implement it nationwide. And luckily for us, we've already done that in Croydon between 2018 and 2022.
So what they did was introduce a supplementary planning document, which was aiming to guide suburban intensification across the whole borough. And it's a 200-page document. If you haven't read it, it's a really easy read. It just draws out what is allowable and what isn't allowable. It draws you examples of different types of development that might happen. It has light fixing rules, stuff like that. And basically says, if you come forward and propose that you're going to do something which fits this book, you're allowed. And we will say yes.
This SPD accepted that with a growing population there is a necessity to build more homes, but that with Croydon there are a number of low density and suburban locations which have been identified as having the capacity and ability to accommodate additional housing. It recognised, however, that delivering new homes in suburban areas would result in a change of character, and its aim therefore was to properly manage this evolution. It had diagrams like this one explaining how a typical suburban area could be gently intensified with more housing, filling gap sites with smaller apartment buildings and townhouses, delivering new homes without dramatically changing the character of the area. In other words, it prescribed early on what would and wouldn't be allowed, which is similar to what we see in the planning systems in France and Japan.
So if you imagine that if you were going to buy a detached house in southern Croydon and you wanted to build 10 flats on that land, you would have been like, I don't know if they're going to allow me to do that. I don't know if I'm going to spend £1.2 million buying that house, so I'm not going to do it. Whereas now, okay, so I know that if I build 10 flats, they're going to be worth £3 million. And I know that it costs me £1 million to build them. And I know it costs me £1.2 million to buy the house. I know I can make a chunky profit. And I know in the process of doing that, we'll build some new homes. That's good. Then you do it. Because they've got rules in place, they can go to the bank and say, give me a loan. But if the rules aren't in place, then the bank's not going to give you that loan because it'll be like, no, this is too risky. It wasn't a radical policy in that it didn't allow massive height. So these blocks of flats are only 3 stories tall, and they're not allowed to be out of keeping with the kind of broad existing roofline. But you can still, even within those constraints, deliver way more housing than was there previously.
By front-loading the discretionary element of the planning process and giving developers more confidence that what they'd spent loads of money and time planning wasn't going to be rejected, they managed to significantly boost house building with nearly 2,000 more homes on small suburban sites, turning Croydon into an outlier compared to all other London boroughs. Imagine how many more homes could be delivered if we rolled this out nationwide.
So what they see is a 3 times increase in the production of a particular type of housing which was permitted through this supplementary planning document.
The plan meant that only 1 in every 500 detached and semi-detached homes were deleted every year, with a small new build block of flats built in its place. It delivered homes gradually, lowering risk and opening the market to smaller developers and local firms. Maurice mentioned that at that pace it would take more than 500 years to replace every home in Croydon. If we look at how much Croydon has changed in the last 500 years, the proposed changes are modest at most. And densifying existing urban land is far more efficient than allowing cities to sprawl further into precious countryside.
But then it also hits a wall. Because it's an optional tool to be using, it then became a political football council that then the opposition to the council were running on. It's kind of shocking to the British expectation of the suburb. So you expect to live in a suburb and it just to be houses. And you expect it to be just houses forever. And what this did was change that. But that was also enough to kick up a political fuss. And then because the Conservatives won the next election, they immediately removed it, as was promised in their manifesto, because they were allowed to, because the British planning system doesn't mandate the use of this kind of tool. And so then you're back to square one. And then house building drops off a year later and goes back to what it was before. What's interesting is thinking about how the system can evolve and use these tools more. So I think the long term, we need to see a system where more local authorities are doing what Croydon did.
Since entering power in mid-2024, the UK government has been pretty proactive at recognising and addressing many of the problems outlined in this video. Their Planning and Infrastructure Bill is designed to turbocharge house building by cutting blockers to speed up planning decisions. The National Planning Policy Framework has seen 2 major changes which effectively make it easier to approve building homes at high densities around transport hubs and in town and city centres. They've also set up an initiative to unlock smaller plots and support small and medium-sized builders, proposing to create a new housing bank to provide lower-cost financing for housing projects. And they've introduced a new commission for major infrastructure projects to cut consultation times and accelerate the delivery of transport and utility schemes that underpin new housing.
And it's like some of the biggest changes in UK planning law in decades, possibly since the 1940s. As soon as they came in mid-2024, they said they were going to rewrite the National Policy Planning Framework. They did rewrite it, and it came out 6 months later, and it was a bit better. Roll on a year, just before Christmas in 2025, another attempt to reform the National Policy Planning Framework. We weren't expecting much. And then all of a sudden we all started listening, because it was actually quite radical.
The current government has really made house building quite a priority, and it's done some things that we think are really important. It's done some other things that we think are less important. It hasn't done some of the things that we think are important exactly. Some explicit bits and some of the subtext is urban authorities should use these tools more. They still fall short of saying they must.
And what currently happens is that the harms are balanced against the benefits. But now for a location like Shoreditch Works, near a train station in a built-up area, the harms would now have to substantially outweigh the benefits. So that's a really important change. There's a lot of other changes in there too, and they're basically all to the positive. So, if they stick to it, this could be really impactful. And I think, to be honest, they've left it too late for them to meet their 1.5 million homes target. So if I was a Labour Party apparatchik, I'd be a bit upset that it's taken this long. But I'm not. I just want to get more houses built. It's the best thing anyone has done for decades, and I'm still not sure it's enough.
But the only type of house building which is going to be automatically allowed is that kind of higher density building. So it's not going to lead to lots of random sprawl or itty-bitty development. It's going to be sort of bigger things happening. But they also then layer over something like kind of national level rule, which says that if you're within a given walkable distance from a train station, a thing similar to the Croydon thing kind of applies. And then that has an impact in cities, because anywhere which is currently a lot lower than 50 dwellings per hectare, anything that comes forward within that is going to have to be an increase in density. But then the NPPF also goes a bit further and says urban planning authorities should also be trying to introduce minimum densities everywhere. And so that is the very beginnings of a zoning plan. So it should have a knock-on impact in cities. I don't think they're going quite as far as they should. It's quite funny the way they changed the language. Previously, local authorities were encouraged to use local development orders. The new NPPF says local authorities and mayors are going to be strongly encouraged to use local development orders and mayoral development orders. That is still not a must, right? And I don't know what the kind of implications of moving from encouraged to strongly encouraged are.
So the future feels a bit more promising, but we still have a long way to go to address many of the structural issues that have allowed this problem to swell up for so long. But the prize for simply building more flats might be that we fix a multitude of other problems facing the UK as well. Not just rising housing costs or not being able to find somewhere close to work, or generational hopelessness brought on by young people recognising that they might never be able to own their own home, but also our decaying high streets. The fact that many Brits are living in fuel poverty due to living in old houses that lack modern insulation, our flailing productivity rate, and our sluggish economic growth.
It takes time for attitudes and cultures to be shaped and changed by policy, and you can't immediately get a culture change just through changing policy, right? But you can also try and change policy to try and get that cultural change, and then that thing can try and bed itself in over time. When we were speaking to kind of experts on France and Japan, when we were putting together the research, it was quite illuminating that some of our questions just didn't ring true. They were like, would you have massive opposition to this? Rather than no, we don't, because the system stops that. They were like, why would that even be a question? Because there is a kind of broader based acceptance that stuff happens. But it's just going to take a bit of a culture change and a bit of a acceptance of things being torn down and newer things being built in their place.
I want to thank Maurice and Michael for agreeing to be on this video. I was speaking to both of them for well over an hour, and obviously I've had to cut out a lot of our discussion to fit into this video. If you want to see the full length versions of each interview, I've put them on my Patreon and you can go and check them out there if you want. I had to gloss over a lot of the discussion topics in this video just to keep it under 5 hours long. So if you want me to go into greater detail on any of the topics I've mentioned, please pop it in the comments below and I'll consider doing a future video just doing a sort of a deeper dive into each of the discussion points. This is something that I'm clearly really passionate about, so if you want to see more stuff like this, please do like and subscribe so that I can continue making videos like this. I truly believe that if the UK does some of the things I've outlined in this video, it would go a long way to helping to solve some of the current issues that we're facing and help build on the fact that we're already one of the most astonishing places on Earth. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video.